She walked down the aisle in white. The church bells tolled, the flowers swayed, and the congregation rose to their feet. Every face turned toward her, radiant and trembling with joy, as the young bride of Ravenswood took her final steps toward a future she would never see. Within hours, the vows spoken that day would become whispers of horror. The marriage that promised new beginnings ended not in celebration, but in a grave. This is not a tale of love fulfilled. It is a story of a wedding dress soaked in grief, a husband left staring at empty vows, and a community forever haunted by the echo of a single day. On that fateful afternoon in 1872, a bride's laughter was silenced, her bouquet left abandoned at the altar. Was it fate, misfortune, or something more sinister that turned joy into mourning? The story of the forgotten bride of Ravenswood has lingered for over a century, passed down in whispers and warnings. Some say her spirit still walks among the pews, searching for the life denied to her. Others claim her tragic end was no accident at all. Tonight, we peel back the layers of history and superstition, tracing each step that led from altar to grave. But be warned, this is not just history. This is the kind of story that clings to you, the kind of story that does not rest quietly in the past. If you're drawn to tales where love turns to shadows, and where the line between fact and folklore blurs, then stay with us. And before we begin, remember to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows and share your thoughts in the comments below. Who knows, your voice may be the one to awaken the echoes of Ravenswood. Ravenswood in 1872 was a town suspended between progress and tradition. The railways had begun to slice across the countryside, carrying whispers of industrial change, yet much of daily life remained bound to the rhythm of the church bell and the marketplace. The town square bustled with merchants and carriages, while beyond the cobblestones, sprawling estates watched over the land like silent sentinels. To its citizens, Ravenswood was a community of familiar faces, where everyone knew the names of their neighbors, and secrets rarely stayed buried for long. In such a place, a wedding was more than a union between two people. It was a spectacle that bound the entire town. Invitations were not merely sent. They were expected. From the wealthiest landowners to the seamstress who had stitched the gown, all had a stake in the celebration. And when the daughter of a respected family prepared to marry, Ravenswood treated the event as though it belonged to them all. The Victorians held marriage as sacred, a contract not just of love but of duty and alliance. For young women, the ceremony represented more than personal happiness. It was the pinnacle of societal expectation, the mark of honor for both family name and reputation. The bride of this tale embodied those ideals, graceful, dutiful, and full of promise. She was not simply a woman in love. She was Ravenswood's shining figure of purity and hope. But hope has a fragile edge. In the era of superstition and whispered omens, townsfolk clung to signs as tightly as scripture. A dropped ring, a torn veil, a sudden chill on the morning of vows. Any of these could be interpreted as ill fate. And so, when tragedy struck in Ravenswood, many refused to see it as mere chance. For them, it was the fulfillment of a warning, a curse woven into the very fabric of the day. The tale of the forgotten bride does not live only in the dusty pages of parish records. It survives in the folklore of the region, in the stories murmured around fireplaces when the night grows long. To understand the haunting of Ravenswood, one must first understand the weight of that community, the expectations placed upon one young woman, and the shadows that followed her down the aisle. Every story of tragedy begins with lives that once glimmered with promise. To understand the sorrow of Ravenswood, we must step into the world of the young bride and the man who stood waiting for her at the altar. She was known in town as Eleanor Whitcomb, daughter of a merchant family whose fortunes had been steady, if not extravagant. Eleanor's father traded in textiles, a business that tethered him to the web of Victorian commerce stretching from London's docks to small-town storefronts like Ravenswood. Her mother, Clara, was a woman steeped in the traditions of the era, keen on etiquette, vigilant in propriety, and fiercely protective of her daughter's reputation. Eleanor was their only surviving child, which made her not only precious but also burdened with expectation. From an early age, Eleanor was described as luminous. Neighbors recalled her as a girl with a quick laugh and a gaze that seemed older than her years, a young woman who walked with the grace of someone destined to be admired. She was educated at home, as was customary, with lessons in music, needlework, and scripture. Yet she possessed a curiosity that often led her beyond the books her tutors prescribed. Some remembered her sketching among the grave markers of the old churchyard. Others found her humming strange melodies on the edge of the forest. It was this mixture of refinement and quiet strangeness that made her both beloved and slightly mysterious. The groom, Jonathan Harrow, came from a family of standing in Ravenswood's countryside estates. His lineage stretched back to landowners who had overseen vast acres of farmland, their fortunes built on grain and livestock. Jonathan himself was a man of ambition tempered by solemnity. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that betrayed a restless determination, he carried the air of one who understood both privilege and responsibility. Unlike many of his peers, he was not content with idle inheritance. He involved himself in the management of his family's estates and was known for his interest in agricultural reform, an echo of the Victorian fascination with progress. Jonathan's courtship of Eleanor was seen as both natural and desirable. Their union promised to bind two respected families, to strengthen ties within Ravenswood, and to embody the harmony of tradition with the promise of the future. Town gossips whispered approvingly of their appearances at Sunday service, their quiet exchanges at gatherings, and the way Eleanor's cheeks flushed when Jonathan's name was spoken. To those who observed them, the match seemed inevitable, ordained by both affection and society's blessing. Yet even within this idyllic picture, shadows lurked. Some spoke of Eleanor's fragile health, of fainting spells that were politely dismissed as nerves. Others remembered her vivid dreams, which she occasionally recounted in unsettling detail, visions of walking down endless corridors, of cold hands clutching her gown, of voices calling her name from the earth. Jonathan, for his part, carried scars of his own. A brother lost in childhood, a father stern to the point of cruelty. These memories forged in him a resolve but also a melancholy that few understood. Despite these undercurrents, the people of Ravenswood adored the couple. Their engagement announcement was celebrated in the parish paper, described in glowing prose as a union of virtue and promise. The town seamstress spoke with pride of the gown she had been commissioned to create, a confection of white silk and lace that seemed to shimmer even in lamplight. Bakers prepared confections, musicians tuned their instruments, and invitations were sent across the county. For Eleanor and Jonathan, the future seemed poised like a delicate glass, fragile but brilliant. On the morning of their vows, Ravenswood awaited a spectacle of joy, unaware that within hours, its brightest promise would be extinguished. The morning of June 14, 1872, broke with an unsettling beauty. The sky over Ravenswood was clear yet pale, the kind of washed-out blue that seemed to carry no warmth despite the promise of summer. By dawn, the town was already alive with movement. Carriages rattled over cobblestones, ribbons fluttered from doorways, and neighbors hurried with parcels and baskets, all determined to take part in the day that would be remembered long after they themselves were gone. Eleanor awoke early in the Whitcomb household, the house filled with the aroma of fresh bread and the murmur of servants preparing. She dressed in silence, attended by her mother and two companions, each stitch of her gown smoothed, each curl of her hair pinned with care. The dress itself was a masterpiece of Victorian craft, ivory silk embroidered with tiny sprays of lilies, its lace veil cascading like a waterfall of light. Yet those who stood near her whispered that her complexion was pale, her smile fleeting, as though she carried a private burden beneath the finery. By mid-morning, the church bells of St. Mary's began to toll, summoning the congregation. The building loomed at the heart of Ravenswood, its stone walls darkened by centuries of weather, its spire reaching toward the heavens. Inside, the air was thick with incense and expectation. Families filed into pews polished by generations, the murmur of voices swelling and dipping like the tide. Candles flickered, casting long shadows across stained-glass saints who seemed to watch the proceedings with solemn eyes. Jonathan arrived first, resplendent in his dark suit. his demeanor calm though his hands betrayed a nervous tension. He greeted elders, exchanged nods with friends, and then took his place at the altar. Observers noted how he adjusted his cuffs again and again, as though to steady himself against the weight of the moment. When Eleanor finally entered, escorted by her father, the entire church rose. Gasps swept through the hall as she appeared, radiant yet fragile, a vision in white. The organ thundered with hymns, but for many, the music seemed distant. All eyes were fixed on the bride, her veil trembling slightly as though stirred by an invisible hand. She walked slowly, each step echoing against the stone floor, the bouquet of white roses clutched tightly in her grasp. There were moments during the ceremony when unease rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's voice wavered during her vows, and a hush fell as she seemed to falter before completing the sacred words. Jonathan's hand reached for hers, steadying her, and the officiant pressed onward, determined not to let the moment unravel. Still, those in attendance would later recall the atmosphere shifting. The sudden chill despite the summer day, the flicker of candles as though disturbed by a draft, the heavy silence that fell in between the echoes of the priest's voice. Superstitious whispers would grow from these details, but at the time, the congregation merely sat with unease they could not name. As the ceremony concluded, the couple turned to face their guests, bound by vows spoken before God and community. Applause erupted, the organ swelled, and yet in the eyes of some witnesses, Eleanor's expression appeared distant, her lips forming a faint smile that never touched her eyes. She clutched Jonathan's arm tightly, as though bracing herself against a tide unseen by others. The procession moved outward into the churchyard, where ribbons fluttered and voices rang with cheer. Children scattered petals, musicians struck up lively tunes, and the townsfolk prepared for a day of revelry. Yet beneath the surface joy, a tension clung like mist, an unspoken sense that the day was not unfolding as it should. By the time the wedding feast began, laughter and music filled the Whitcomb estate. Yet the bride, pale and withdrawn, seemed increasingly fragile. She raised her glass in a trembling hand, her smile fleeting, her gaze often lost beyond the merriment. And then, within hours, the celebration would turn to chaos. The hour of celebration turned in a heartbeat. What had begun as the most joyous day Ravenswood had ever witnessed would soon descend into a nightmare so profound it would be remembered for generations. The feast at the Whitcomb estate had reached its height. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, sugared confections, and goblets of wine that sparkled in the sunlight. Musicians played lively airs, and the laughter of guests echoed through the grand hall. Eleanor, seated at Jonathan's side, lifted her glass once more. Yet those closest to her remarked on the way her hand shook, the pallor of her face almost ghostly against the brilliance of her gown. At first, it was nothing more than a cough, a soft sound that drew little attention. She tried to smile, waving away Jonathan's concern. But then came another cough, harder, deeper, followed by a tremor in her frame. The room's laughter faltered. Eleanor's bouquet slipped from her hand, petals scattering across the table like drops of snow. Within seconds, her body convulsed. The goblet shattered against the floor. Guests leapt to their feet, shouts rising, the musicians stumbling into silence. Jonathan was at her side instantly, clutching her hand, calling her name. But Eleanor's eyes rolled back, her lips parting in a gasp that seemed to drain the very air from the hall. Chaos erupted. Some cried out for water, others for a physician. Servants rushed, dishes clattering, chairs scraping, the ordered harmony of celebration torn apart. Eleanor was lowered to the floor, her veil spread around her like a shroud. Jonathan knelt, his voice breaking as he begged her to open her eyes. But her chest heaved only once, twice, and then stilled. The silence that followed was unbearable. Dozens of guests stood frozen, unable to believe what they had witnessed. A bride, moments from beginning a new life, now lay motionless before them. Mothers clutched their children, men muttered prayers, and the officiant who had only hours earlier declared the union now whispered last rites. Whispers began almost immediately. Poison, a weak heart, curse. Each voice carried fear, suspicion, disbelief. How could a young woman, radiant only minutes earlier, fall so suddenly, so fatally? Jonathan's grief was violent and raw. He lifted her into his arms, refusing to accept the stillness of her body. He called her name again and again, his voice echoing through the hall like a lament. No hand could comfort him, no word could console. To many, the sight of the groom clutching his lifeless bride was an image that seared itself into memory, too terrible to be forgotten. The physician who arrived could do little more than pronounce what all already knew. Eleanor was gone. No remedies, no prayers, no desperate attempts could reverse what had taken place. In the space of an instant, the wedding of Ravenswood had become its funeral. The hall emptied into the night like a procession of shadows. Guests fled in stunned silence, some weeping openly, others crossing themselves as though warding away evil. The Whitcomb family collapsed into grief, Clara's wails piercing the dark, and Jonathan, stripped of bride, future, and joy, sat in the ruins of celebration, his hands still trembling with the weight of what he had lost. In the days that followed, Ravenswood would be consumed with rumor and speculation. Some claimed they had seen Eleanor falter even before the vows. Others whispered of poisoned wine or an ancestral curse that had long haunted the Whitcomb line. Whatever the truth, one fact remained unshakable. The bride who had walked down the aisle in white was now carried back in black, her grave prepared before the echo of the wedding bells had even faded. The days that followed the wedding were unlike anything Ravenswood had ever endured. What had been prepared as a week of celebration transformed overnight into a period of mourning so heavy it seemed to settle over every stone and doorway. The Whitcomb estate, once filled with music and laughter, became a house of wails and whispered prayers. Black drapes were hung across its windows, the festive ribbons torn down, the air thick with the sound of grief. Eleanor's mother, Clara, refused to leave her daughter's side. She sat for hours beside the coffin, her hands folded around the rosary that had been her comfort in life, her eyes red from tears that refused to cease. Her father, a man known for his composure, walked the halls in silence, his footsteps slow and hollow. Neighbors who came to offer condolences often left in tears themselves, overwhelmed by the suffocating sorrow that seemed to cling to the very walls. Jonathan Harrow's anguish was the most visible. He wandered between the church and the Whitcomb home like a shadow of himself, refusing food, refusing rest. Some said he spoke aloud to Eleanor as though she might yet hear him. Others claimed he stood by her grave even in the rain, silent, his dark coat plastered to his frame, his eyes fixed on the earth that separated him from the woman he had only just called his wife. The community was shaken. News traveled quickly, carried by whispers in taverns, by hurried conversations in the marketplace, by parish gossip after Sunday service. How could such a thing happen in their town, on a day that had promised only joy? Some sought explanations in science, a weak heart, a hidden illness. Others turned to darker interpretations. Foul play, a poisoned chalice, or the wrath of a curse. The more superstitious clutched charms and muttered prayers, fearing that Ravenswood itself had been touched by misfortune. The local papers seized the story, their ink heavy with tragedy. Headlines spoke of the bride who fell, the wedding of shadows, and the death that stilled the bells of Ravenswood. Readers far beyond the town devoured the accounts, their imaginations caught by the Gothic horror of a wedding ending in sudden death. Yet no article could fully capture the raw grief of those who had seen it with their own eyes. Eleanor was buried in the churchyard within days, her gown altered into a funeral shroud. The same bells that had rung for her wedding tolled again, this time with mournful slowness, each peal echoing through the valley like a lament. The procession wound its way through silent streets, every face somber, every step heavy. Children clung to their mothers, elders bowed their heads, and Jonathan walked behind the coffin as though carved from stone. Ravenswood would never forget that week. The memory of celebration undone by death lingered in every corner, in every hushed conversation, in every flicker of candlelight within the church. The tragedy had scarred the town, leaving behind not only grief but a question that no one could answer. Why had the bride of Ravenswood been taken so suddenly, so cruelly, on the day that should have been her beginning? In the weeks that followed Eleanor's burial, Ravenswood became consumed not only with grief but with questions. How could a young woman, seemingly healthy, collapse and die so suddenly on the very day she was meant to begin her married life? The lack of clear answers created fertile ground for theories, both rational and supernatural, each whispered with certainty by those who believed themselves closest to the truth. The first and most widely accepted explanation was illness. Physicians of the time suggested Eleanor may have suffered from a hidden heart condition. Fainting spells, which had been politely dismissed as nerves before her wedding, were now reinterpreted as ominous signs. Victorians understood little of congenital defects or sudden cardiac failure, and to them, Eleanor's collapse was a grim reminder of how fragile the human body could be. Yet even this medical reasoning failed to quiet the rumors. To many, it seemed too convenient, too incomplete. Another theory grew darker: poison. Guests recalled the moment she raised her goblet, how quickly her decline began after the toast. Whispers circulated about a tainted chalice, about rivals jealous of her beauty, or enemies of her family seeking vengeance cloaked in tragedy. No evidence was ever produced, no vial of toxin uncovered, but the idea lingered in the imagination. Some claimed Jonathan himself was the target, and that Eleanor had merely been the one to drink first. Still others spoke of curses. Ravenswood was a town steeped in superstition, where omens were taken seriously. The flickering candles during the ceremony, the chill that swept the church despite the summer air, these were seen as warnings. Old families recalled legends of the Whitcomb line, tales of ancestors who had wronged their kin and carried misfortune through the generations. Eleanor's death, they claimed, was not chance but fate. The curse had claimed her on the day she stepped into womanhood as wife and mother-to-be. There were also those who turned to the spiritual. Parishioners whispered of seeing Eleanor's ghostly form in the churchyard, wandering in her gown among the gravestones. Others claimed to hear her voice in the wind that swept the pews at night, a faint melody echoing the hymns of her wedding. To some, these stories were proof that she had not been ready to leave this world, that her spirit clung to Ravenswood, tethered by vows unfulfilled. Yet amidst the speculation, another theory remained unspoken in polite circles but persistent in whispers: that Eleanor herself knew her fate. Friends recalled her strange dreams, the way she described hands clutching her gown, corridors without end, voices calling from the earth. Did she foresee her own death? Did she walk down the aisle already burdened with a knowledge no one else could understand? The absence of truth only deepened the fascination. Each theory, whether scientific, sinister, or supernatural, became part of the legend. For the people of Ravenswood, Eleanor's death could not be reduced to mere accident. It had to mean something, to carry a weight beyond randomness. And so they gave it shape in stories, in curses, in visions, until the tragedy became more than history. It became myth. To this day, local historians debate the evidence, while folklorists embrace the spectral echoes. Perhaps the truth lies in the cold reality of illness. Or perhaps, as the townsfolk believed, Ravenswood's forgotten bride was claimed by forces beyond understanding. What is certain is this: her death was not only an end, but the beginning of a mystery that time itself has never been able to silence. Years passed, but Ravenswood never truly healed from the loss of its bride. The story lingered like a shadow in the narrow lanes, whispered in the marketplace, and retold in hushed voices whenever church bells rang. To outsiders, it was a tragic tale. To those who lived in Ravenswood, it was a wound that never closed. Eleanor's grave became the heart of that memory. The stone, carved with lilies and a verse of scripture, drew mourners long after the family had ceased to visit. Children dared each other to place flowers there at night, and couples, superstitious or not, avoided walking past it after dusk. The white roses she dropped at her wedding feast became a symbol in themselves. Women in Ravenswood whispered that if a petal fell from a bridal bouquet before the vows were spoken, misfortune would surely follow. Stories grew darker with time. Parish caretakers claimed to hear soft footsteps in the nave of St. Mary's after midnight, the faint rustle of silk skirts brushing along the pews. Others swore they had seen a pale figure standing near the altar, her face hidden behind a veil, waiting for a groom who would never arrive. The church bells, some insisted, rang strangely on the anniversary of her death, the tones warped, as though the metal itself remembered grief. For historians, the tragedy became a cautionary tale of Victorian fragility, of women's lives hemmed in by societal duty and vulnerability. For folklorists, it became a legend, a story where truth and superstition entwined until neither could be separated. And for Ravenswood itself, it became an identity. The town was no longer just a place on a map. It was the resting ground of the forgotten bride, a woman whose final steps defined its memory. Even today, visitors to Ravenswood are told her story. Some leave flowers, others light candles, all drawn by the echo of a life that ended too soon. For in every retelling, Eleanor Whitcomb walks once more, down the aisle, into the grave, and into the hearts of those who cannot forget her. The tale of Eleanor Whitcomb is more than a tragedy etched into the past. It is a reminder of how quickly joy can wither, how fragile even the brightest hopes may be. A wedding meant to unite two families became a symbol of sorrow, a single day that transformed Ravenswood forever. Her story is not just a record in parish books. It is a presence, a whisper that lingers in every corner of that town. Even now, when dusk settles and the bells of St. Mary's toll across the valley, some swear they hear her footsteps echoing down the aisle. A veil drifting in candlelight, a bouquet lying abandoned on stone, promise never fulfilled. These visions, whether born of imagination or something far older, ensure that Eleanor is never truly forgotten. We can search for medical reasons, cling to logic, or surrender to superstition, but perhaps the truth lies not in answers but in memory. For in remembering her, we give life to her story, keeping her spirit awake, walking beside us through the shadows of history. And as you leave this tale behind tonight, ask yourself, do tragedies like this ever truly rest? Or do they live on, waiting to be retold again and again? If this story has haunted you, then subscribe to Grave of the Shadows and share your thoughts in the comments below. Perhaps your voice will be the next to keep the memory of Ravenswood's forgotten bride alive.